Hey, Dan here. We're going to talk about sour beer off flavors today. This is a subject that's a little bit difficult to understand. It's similar to clean beers. There's some overlap there as far as some of the off flavors, but some of the off flavors in sour beers can be a little bit different and maybe a little bit new to some people. So we're going to go through some of these off flavors and explain to you what they are and what causes them, and in some cases how to avoid them. I'm going to start with off flavors that tend to be harder to get rid of, uh, more serious off flavors in sour beers. And then we'll go down to some of the flavors that are kind of considered to be off flavored by some people, but not by others. Some of the off flavors that can age out or be blended out, things like that. So let's start with acetic acid. Acetic acid is caused by Brettanomyces and Acetobacter. It can also be caused by lactobacillus. Certain strains or species might create acetic acid. Acetic acid is generally created in the presence of oxygen by any of those microbes. And if you get too much acetic acid in your beer, it'll start to taste a little bit vinegary. A little bit of acetic acid is okay. It'll give it a nice balance. But too much, and you'll get kind of a vinegar flavor. I recommend checking out my airlocks video. I'll link that here somewhere. That will talk about some of the issues with keeping air out of your fermenter to prevent too much acetic acid. Next up is ethyl acetate. Ethyl acetate is created by Brettanomyces by combining an acetic acid and an ethanol. In small amounts it tastes like a pineapple type of flavor, and it can be quite desirable. In higher amounts though, it starts to smell like nail polish. Some people will say that you can blend that back, but because ethyl acetate has a high threshold, taste and odor threshold, and I've done that before with some success, I believe. Um, Other people will say not to blend it back though, including Jay Goodwin. He says that every time he's tried to do that, ethyl acetate will build itself back up. For example, in bottles, there's a small amount of oxygen that can permeate bottles, and over time, the ethyl acetate can build back up. Another off flavor that you'll also see in clean beers is acetone. Acetone is created when Saccharomyces or Brettanomyces is fermented too hot. So if you're fermenting too hot, you might get some acetone off flavors. Those are not going to go away in a sour beer. So next time, just watch your fermentation temperatures. Keep your fermentation temperatures in check with what the Saccharomyces strain that you're using requires. And same thing with Brettanomyces. As soon as you pitch your bread, it may kick off another fermentation. Try to keep that under temperature control, at least for the first 3 to 4 weeks. That's what I try to do. Some other off flavors are phenolics that smell kind of like burnt rubber, or Band-Aid type flavors. These can be from wild yeasts. So if you have some sort of a wild yeast infection, which you can have in sour beers, you can get these off flavors, and these off flavors generally aren't going to go away. And they're also very difficult to blend out. So now we'll get on to some of the less offensive off flavors that you can find in sour beers, or less permanent off flavors in sour beer. Brettanomyces has the ability to clean up or metabolize a lot of these compounds and turn them into other things. So we'll start off talking about butyric acid. This is one of my least favorite flavors, off flavors. Butyric acid is present in vomit, and it's what gives your vomit that aroma. And it's created by Brettanomyces and bacteria. Sour mashing is one of the causes of creating a lot of butyric acid. Butyric acid can be converted into an ester by Brettanomyces in small amounts. In large amounts, you're usually stuck with it, and it's really off-putting off flavor. Next up is isovillaric acid. This is best described, or usually described, as kind of like a foot odor. The bacteria that's naturally on your skin creates isovillaric acid naturally, so we're very familiar with this smell and taste. It can be also created by Brettanomyces. I find that in sour beers that have been fruited, isovillaric acid can pop up. In large amounts, it's pretty off-putting. In small amounts, for me personally, I think it adds a layer of complexity because it kind of melds with the other flavors in the beer. It kind of creates this interesting kind of a funky flavor. Butyric or isovillaric acid, excuse me, can age out. It can change over time. The next one is a really fun one. This is tetrahydropyridines. And this is a small molecule. It's considered a ketone, and it tastes kind of like Cheerios or Captain Crunch in small, moderate amounts. In high amounts, it can taste like urine. It can be an off flavor in wine as well. It tends to creep up when you package your sour beer when it's carbonated. Nobody really knows why Brettanomyces creates it, or how it really creates it, or how it breaks it down, because after about 2 or 3 months, the tetrahydropyridine, or THP for short, will break down and will go away. In small amounts, some people consider it desirable, I think. For me, I consider it an off flavor regardless of whether it's present or not. It's not completely off-putting, but it is distracting from the overall beer. It doesn't really meld into the flavors of a sour beer very well. Next thing to talk about is oxidation. Now, with sour beer with Brettanomyces in it, Brettanomyces is an antioxidant, so it's very good at keeping away the wet cardboard flavors, trans 2, non-nol. I'll put a link down below referencing that. However, you can also get oxidized melanoidins in sour beers I've tasted, and that kind of gives the beer a little bit of a sherry flavor to it. If there's a little bit of that, it adds to the complexity of the beer. If there's too much of it, the beer becomes a little bit one-dimensional. So with too much oxygen, you'll get ethyl acetate and acetic acid, but you could also get too much of that sherry character. That usually only occurs in the darker colored beers that do have more melanoidin content. Next up is diacetyl. Diacetyl is a problem in clean beers too, but also in sour beers. Some strains of Pediococcus will create diacetyl. Over time, the Brettanomyces should break that diacetyl down. Now, diacetyl usually occurs in more Pediococcus-centered sour beers, not really the Lactobacillus-centered American sour beers. I've had it in a couple of Guzes, for example, or Lambics from Belgium. And I think it develops kind of late in the process, and if you don't age the beer long enough, the Brettanomyces won't break that diacetyl down. If there's too much diacetyl, it won't be able to break it all down. So diacetyl is another thing to be aware of if you're using a lot of Pediococcus. Other off flavors include some of the organic or fatty acids that Brettanomyces can create. A range of these will be kind of rancid or goaty as they're described. I don't have a lot of experience with them myself, because they do tend to break down, I think, pretty quickly. However, if you have kind of rancid flavors, you might need to age the beer out a little bit. It could also be from an infection. Next up are kind of the funky phenolics that Brettanomyces will create. Some people don't like that and consider that an off flavor. Other people like it in small amounts. I'm one of those people. In great amounts, it just can be too overwhelming. We're talking about the barnyardy, medicinal, plastic, smoky, sometimes barnyard funk, people will refer to it. And those flavors will kind of meld in with other flavors like the isovillaric acid. And if they're well balanced, then they sometimes are good. If they're out of balance, though, it's just too much, and you could consider that an off flavor. And finally, too much of a good thing can be a bad thing, and that's the case with acid. A lot of people will think that acetic acid is more harsh than lactic acid, and I think perhaps that's true. However, don't confuse that with if you have the burn in the back of your throat and your esophagus when you take a sip of sour beer. Too much lactic acid can definitely also cause that. I've tasted a little bit of pure lactic acid and actually got an acid burn on my tongue. So lactic acid in high amounts can also be just too acidic and burn your throat. And if you have that much acid, you probably want to blend the beer with maybe a non-acidic Brettanomyces beer, because you really don't want a super sour beer. You want sour beers to be drinkable and just nicely sour on the palate. So that's about it for the basic off flavors in sour beers. I hope that you learned something. I'd like to give a shout out to some of my references for this video. That would include Matt Miller's article on the Sour Beer blog. I'll link that below on blending out some of the off flavors. Definitely recommend that you give that a read. Also Michael Tonsmeyer's book, American Sour Beers, and the Milk the Funk Wiki. I'll link some of the articles below. A few of those I wrote myself, and I strongly recommend that you give those a read as well. And cheers, and good luck with your sour brewing.